The first light of morning had not yet reached the wide waters of the Nile. The stars still rested quietly above the dark land, and the air held the coolness that would soon disappear beneath the growing sun. A gentle breeze moved through tall reeds beside the river, carrying the soft scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then became quiet again. Small waves touched the muddy banks with a slow and steady rhythm that had sounded the same for countless generations. In a village not far from the river, most homes were still wrapped in darkness. Their mud brick walls had gathered the cool air of the night. Flat roofs rested beneath the fading stars, and narrow doorways remained closed for only a little while longer. Soon another ordinary day would begin, much like the day before it and much like the thousands of days that had come before. Inside one of these homes, a woman slowly opened her eyes before the first hint of sunrise. There was no loud sound to wake her. No bell rang through the village. Her body simply knew the hour. Years of daily routine had become as dependable as the rising sun itself. For a few quiet moments she remained still. Around her, the room was peaceful. Her children continued sleeping on woven reed mats laid across the smooth floor. Their breathing rose and fell in slow, gentle rhythm. A clay jar rested beside the wall. Baskets stood neatly arranged where they had been placed the night before. A small oil lamp had burned low during the evening and now gave only the faintest glow. She listened carefully. Outside, the village was beginning to stir. Someone nearby opened a wooden door. Sandals softly brushed against packed earth. A donkey shifted its weight and gave a sleepy snort. Farther away, another family was already preparing for the day. Quiet voices floated through the still air before fading once more into silence. The woman rose slowly so she would not wake the children. Her feet touched the cool floor. She wrapped a simple linen garment around herself and tied it comfortably at the waist. Her hair had been braided the evening before, making the morning routine a little easier. There was much work ahead, and every small moment saved would matter before the heat of midday arrived. Ancient Egyptian women managed households with remarkable skill, though they rarely appeared in the grand stories carved onto temple walls. Kings built monuments that reached toward the sky, but inside thousands of modest homes, women quietly held together the daily lives of families. Their work was not celebrated with towering statues, yet every loaf of bread, every clean garment, every organized storage basket, and every cared-for child depended upon their steady hands. The household was more than a place to sleep. It was a place of endless work. Every day offered another long list of tasks that followed the changing seasons, the flooding of the Nile, and the needs of everyone living beneath the same roof. The woman reached for a clay jar and stepped outside. The morning air felt wonderfully cool against her skin. Soon enough the sun would cover the village with heavy warmth, but for now the darkness remained gentle. She walked toward a nearby well with smooth, practiced steps. Several other women were already there. Nobody hurried. Their conversations remained soft and quiet. One woman asked about an elderly neighbor who had been feeling weak. Another mentioned that her husband would be joining workers repairing irrigation canals later that morning. Someone laughed very gently after remembering something a child had said the previous evening. The sounds blended naturally with the slow creaking of the water bucket. Each woman understood the importance of carrying enough water home before the day became hotter. Water would be needed for drinking, washing vegetables, mixing flour, cleaning dishes, and cooling tired hands after hours of work. Balancing a heavy jar required years of practice. The woman lifted the filled vessel onto her shoulder with calm confidence. She returned home along a dusty path lined with more mud brick houses. Palm trees stood quietly beyond the village. Their leaves moved only slightly in the light breeze. The eastern sky slowly changed from deep blue into pale gray. The first sunlight was coming. Back inside the home, she carefully poured fresh water into larger storage jars. Clay jars helped keep water surprisingly cool throughout the day. Their thick walls protected the precious supply from the strongest heat. Every family depended upon these containers. Without careful storage, daily life would become much harder beneath the Egyptian sun. Now another task waited. Bread. Bread was one of the foundations of nearly every meal. Grain had already been stored inside woven baskets after the last harvest. Some had been carefully protected from insects and moisture for many months. The woman measured what the family would need, neither wasting too much nor preparing too little. Food had to last. Every handful of grain mattered. She poured the grain into a grinding stone. This was one of the most tiring jobs inside the household. The heavy upper stone moved slowly over the lower one again and again. Her shoulders worked steadily. Her arms pushed with patient strength learned over many years. Fine flour slowly collected beneath the stone while tiny particles floated into the cool morning air. Grinding grain demanded both time and endurance. Many women spent several hours each day performing this single task. As the grinding continued, the village slowly awakened. Children emerged from nearby homes rubbing sleepy eyes. Goats wandered through narrow paths. A fisherman carried rolled nets toward the river. A young apprentice hurried after an older craftsman who was already beginning the day's work. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. The woman mixed flour with water and a small portion of yesterday's dough that helped today's bread rise. She kneaded carefully. Her hands moved with quiet confidence. She did not need written instructions. The recipe lived inside memory, passed from mother to daughter across generations whose names had long since disappeared into history. Nearby, one of her children stirred. A small voice called softly. She smiled. The day's work had truly begun. She helped the child wash sleepy hands with cool water before offering a small piece of yesterday's bread. Breakfast remained simple. Perhaps bread. Perhaps onions. Perhaps dates if they had been gathered recently. Sometimes there might be figs. Sometimes beans. Sometimes fish from the Nile if fortune had been kind. Most meals reflected the ordinary rhythm of working families rather than the grand feasts shown in paintings of wealthy households. As more children awakened, the small room filled with quiet movement. One child folded sleeping mats. Another carried empty baskets outside. The youngest watched everything with wide, curious eyes. Household work was rarely performed by only one person. Children learned responsibilities almost as soon as they could walk steadily. They observed. They copied. Slowly they became capable helpers. The woman organized everyone's morning with gentle direction rather than loud commands. There was flour to protect from dust. Water to cover. Tools to return after use. A cracked basket needing repair. Clothing that required washing before stains became permanent beneath the strong sun. Every object inside the home had its proper place. Order made life easier. Without careful organization, small problems quickly became large ones. As sunlight finally crossed the rooftops, warmth entered the village. The mud brick walls glowed softly beneath the growing light. A merchant passed through carrying woven goods balanced across a donkey's back. Another sold fresh vegetables gathered from fertile fields beside irrigation canals. Voices became slightly louder, though never hurried. Ancient Egyptian villages followed the sun more than the clock. Morning remained the busiest part of nearly every day. The woman stepped outside once more. This time she carried clothing toward the river. The Nile gave life to Egypt in countless ways. Its water nourished crops. Its fish fed families. Its mud strengthened bricks. Its steady flooding renewed the soil each year. For women managing households, the river also became a place for washing clothing, gathering water plants, exchanging news, and sharing quiet companionship. Several women knelt along the riverbank. Garments soaked inside shallow water before being rubbed carefully against smooth stones. Soap as we know it did not exist, yet natural materials and patient effort kept clothing remarkably clean. As they worked, conversation flowed gently. Nobody seemed rushed. One woman spoke about preparing extra bread for relatives arriving after the harvest. Another wondered whether this year's flax crop would produce enough linen. An older woman shared memories of floods that had once reached higher than anyone expected. The younger women listened respectfully. Experience held great value. Knowledge passed naturally through everyday conversation rather than formal lessons. Children played nearby under careful watch. Some floated little reed boats across calm water. Others collected smooth stones or chased birds along the riverbank. Every so often a mother called softly to remind them not to wander too close to deeper water. The woman finished washing. She twisted excess water from each garment before laying them across flat rocks where the growing sunlight would slowly dry the fabric. The linen fluttered gently in the breeze. For a moment she simply looked across the river. Fishing boats moved quietly through morning mist. Farmers already worked distant fields. Palm trees reflected softly upon calm water. The world felt peaceful. Yet she knew many hours of work still remained before evening finally arrived. She returned home carrying empty baskets that would soon be filled once again. Inside the house, the temperature had begun to rise. Sunlight entered through the doorway in long golden lines. Dust floated lazily through the bright air. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the oven. Children gathered eagerly. The simple meal offered enough strength for the morning's remaining work. Outside, builders walked toward construction sites carrying wooden tools. Scribes unrolled fresh sheets of papyrus. Potters shaped damp clay upon spinning wheels. Farmers guided oxen toward fields beyond the village. Each person carried different responsibilities. Yet inside nearly every home, women quietly managed the countless details that allowed family life to continue smoothly. Their work rarely stopped. When one task ended, another patiently waited. The rhythm was constant. The rhythm was familiar. And like the slow, endless flow of the Nile itself, it continued gently from one peaceful morning into the next. The morning continued to unfold beneath the steady light of the Egyptian sun. Shadows that had stretched long across the village became shorter with each passing hour. The cool air of dawn slowly disappeared, replaced by warmth that settled over the mud brick walls, the dusty lanes, and the open fields beyond the houses. Yet inside the household, the work continued with the same calm rhythm that had shaped countless ordinary days. The woman carried a woven basket toward the corner of the home where food was stored. This small area, though simple, was one of the most important places in the house. Every family depended upon careful planning. A household was not only cleaned and organized from one day to the next. It was managed across entire seasons. She knelt beside several large clay jars sealed with woven lids. Inside were grains gathered after the harvest. Another jar held dried beans. Smaller baskets contained onions, garlic, and dried herbs whose pleasant scent lingered softly in the cool shade of the room. A bundle of dates rested high on a wooden shelf where insects were less likely to find them. She examined each container slowly. Nothing was done without thought. She knew exactly how much grain remained. She remembered when each basket had been filled. She could tell by sight whether food would last until the next harvest or whether every handful would need to be measured more carefully. Many women possessed this quiet knowledge. They did not write lists upon papyrus. They carried the entire household inside their memory. Every loaf baked, every jar filled, every bundle of flax drying beneath the sun became part of an invisible record held carefully within the mind. Outside, the village had become busier. The narrow streets filled with people moving between homes, workshops, and fields. Sandals pressed gently into the dusty ground. Donkeys carried bundles of reeds and baskets of vegetables. Children chased one another before being called back to help their families. The sounds remained gentle. There was no great noise. Instead there was the soft music of ordinary life. A wooden cart creaked as it rolled along uneven ground. A potter tapped wet clay into shape. A woman shook out a woven mat before laying it in the sunlight. Nearby, someone sang quietly while grinding grain. The melodies were simple and familiar, repeated across generations until no one remembered who had first created them. Inside the home, one of the children approached carrying a cracked basket. The woven reeds had begun to loosen near one corner. The woman smiled gently. Nothing useful was thrown away without reason. Materials required time and effort to gather. Reeds grew along the Nile, but they still needed to be cut, dried, woven, and shaped by careful hands. A damaged basket was repaired many times before it was finally beyond saving. She sat near the doorway where the morning light was brightest. Her fingers moved patiently through the broken weaving. Fresh strips of reed were worked into the old pattern. The repair required no hurry. Each movement felt practiced and peaceful. The child watched closely. Without speaking very much, the mother was teaching. One day these hands would perform the same repairs inside another household. Learning often happened through quiet observation rather than formal instruction. Children watched every movement. How bread was kneaded. How linen was folded. How jars were sealed. How fires were tended. How tools were cleaned before evening. Thousands of small lessons slowly became lifelong habits. The repaired basket was placed beside the others. Now another task waited. The floor needed sweeping. The woman picked up a simple broom made from bundled reeds. Dust gathered easily inside every Egyptian home. Sand drifted beneath doorways whenever the wind crossed the village. Tiny pieces of straw, grain, and dried mud collected during daily work. She swept slowly across the packed earth floor. Small clouds of dust floated into the bright doorway before settling outside. The children helped gather loose scraps into another basket. Even the youngest found little ways to help. One carried empty cups. Another stacked clay bowls after breakfast. Simple responsibilities gave children a place within the household from an early age. The home gradually became orderly once more. Everything rested where it belonged. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread and warm clay. Sunlight touched one wall while the opposite side remained comfortably cool in shadow. Mud brick homes possessed a quiet wisdom of their own. Thick walls helped keep rooms cooler during the hottest part of the day. Small windows allowed air to move gently without letting in too much heat. Flat roofs sometimes became pleasant places to sleep when summer nights stayed especially warm. The woman stepped outside again. She looked toward the fields beyond the village. The green strips of farmland stretched beside the Nile like ribbons laid across the earth. Beyond them lay the pale desert, silent beneath the growing sun. The contrast had always been striking. Life gathered close to the river. Without its yearly floods, much of Egypt would have remained dry and empty. The river shaped everything. It decided planting seasons. It influenced trade. It guided travel. It filled storage jars. It determined whether harvests would be generous or disappointing. Every household depended upon its patient flow. Her husband was already working in those fertile fields. Like many men, his days followed the rhythm of farming. During some seasons he planted grain. During others he repaired irrigation canals or harvested crops beneath the blazing sun. The woman thought of him briefly while preparing another basket. Later she would send food to the fields. Workers could not simply return home whenever they became hungry. Meals often traveled to them. She wrapped fresh bread inside linen cloth. Alongside it she placed onions, dried fish, and a handful of dates. A clay jar of cool water completed the simple meal. One of the older children volunteered to carry the basket. The path toward the fields was familiar. Many children performed similar journeys each day, bringing food to fathers, older brothers, or relatives working far from home. The child walked carefully beneath the strengthening sunlight. The mother watched until the small figure disappeared among the other villagers. Then she turned back toward her remaining work. No household remained quiet for long. A neighbor soon arrived carrying a small bowl. She greeted the woman warmly. Perhaps she needed to borrow a little flour. Perhaps she wished to exchange vegetables gathered that morning. Perhaps she simply hoped for a few peaceful moments of conversation before returning to her own long list of tasks. Neighborly visits formed an important part of village life. Families depended upon one another. If someone became ill, others often helped with water, bread, or child care. If a roof required repair after heavy rain, nearby hands usually appeared without needing to be asked. Communities survived through cooperation as much as individual effort. The two women sat just outside the doorway where a gentle breeze still moved through the narrow lane. Their voices remained soft. They spoke of children growing taller. Of elderly parents whose steps had become slower. Of the coming harvest. Of the weather. Of a merchant who had recently arrived with beautiful bluestones from distant lands. These conversations held no urgency. They simply flowed like the Nile itself. Steady. Gentle. Unhurried. Eventually the neighbor returned home. Silence settled once more around the doorway. The woman lifted a bundle of flax fibers. These pale strands would someday become linen. Ancient Egypt was famous for its fine linen cloth, and much of that cloth began in ordinary homes through countless hours of patient labor. She separated tangled fibers with careful fingers. The work demanded concentration but not speed. As she worked, a small spindle rested beside her. Soon the fibers would be twisted into thread. Later they might be woven into cloth strong enough for clothing, blankets, or household coverings. The spinning wheel had not yet been invented. Everything depended upon steady hands. Hour after hour. Day after day. The spindle turned slowly. Thread formed little by little. The movement became almost hypnotic. Twist. Pull. Turn. Repeat. A rhythm older than memory. Nearby, the youngest child had become sleepy after the morning's activity. The woman spread a woven mat across the coolest part of the floor. The child curled peacefully beneath a light linen cloth. Within moments, slow breathing filled the quiet room. Afternoon naps were common for small children. The heat itself encouraged rest. Even adults often paused briefly during the hottest hours whenever their work allowed it. Outside, the the sunlight had become bright enough to make distant air shimmer above the dusty road. Animals searched for shade beneath palm trees. Dogs stretched lazily near cool walls. Birds became quieter. The village slowed. Work continued, but movements became gentler beneath the heavy warmth. The woman poured herself a small cup of water. She drank slowly. Water remained precious. Every sip reminded her of the long walk before sunrise when the jars had first been filled. She checked them once again. Enough remained. That simple knowledge brought quiet satisfaction. Household management was often made up of these small moments. Knowing enough bread had been baked. Knowing enough water remained. Knowing the grain stores were secure. Knowing every child had eaten. These quiet successes rarely appeared in official records. No temple inscription praised the careful arrangement of storage jars. No royal monument celebrated freshly washed linen hanging in morning sunlight. Yet these ordinary achievements allowed families to survive year after year. The sun climbed still higher. Warm air drifted through the doorway carrying the scent of baked earth. In the distance came the faint sound of wooden tools striking stone where builders continued their work. Somewhere along the river a fisherman called to another boat. The sounds arrived softly, carried upon the breeze before fading once more. The woman stood and stretched her tired shoulders. Grinding grain, carrying water, kneading bread, sweeping floors, repairing baskets, spinning flax, each task left its own quiet mark upon the body. Strong hands. Steady arms. A back accustomed to bending. Feet that knew every path between house, well, field, and river. Her work required endurance more than speed. She stepped into the sunlight again and looked toward the broad ribbon of the Nile. Its waters continued their calm journey northward, reflecting the bright afternoon sky. Boats drifted slowly with the current. Reeds swayed gently along the banks. Life moved at its own ancient pace. And inside thousands of homes stretching from one end of Egypt to the other, countless women followed nearly the same peaceful rhythm, quietly guiding their households through another warm and ordinary day beneath the patient sun. By the time the sun stood high above the valley, the coolness of morning had become only a memory. Warm light rested upon every rooftop, every dusty path, and every quiet stretch of farmland along the Nile. The air shimmered above the open ground, and the stones beneath wandering feet slowly gathered the heat that they would hold until long after sunset. Inside the village, life did not stop because of the warmth. It simply slowed. Movements became more careful. Voices softened even further. People searched for patches of shade whenever their work allowed a brief moment of rest. The thick mud brick walls of each home offered welcome shelter from the brightest hours of the day, and narrow doorways framed quiet scenes of family life continuing at its steady pace. The woman returned to the cool interior of her home after checking the drying linen outside. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the gentle darkness within. Compared with the bright afternoon sun, the room almost felt like evening. The thick walls had done their work well. The floor remained pleasantly cool beneath her sandals. Clay jars stood quietly against the wall. Woven baskets rested exactly where she had placed them. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing seemed out of place. She believed that a peaceful home began with simple order. When every tool had its place, when every basket was easy to find, when every storage jar remained properly covered, daily life became smoother. Small moments of organization saved precious time later in the day, especially when many tasks waited to be finished before darkness arrived. She walked slowly through each corner of the room. One basket held onions gathered several days earlier. Another contained dried lentils. A folded linen cloth covered freshly baked bread, protecting it from dust. She gently lifted the cloth and smiled. The bread still carried a faint warmth. Its pleasant smell filled the room with quiet comfort. Bread was more than food. It was a sign that the household was prepared. As long as bread remained on the shelf and water rested inside the jars, the family could face another day with confidence. She carefully cut several small pieces and placed them aside for the evening meal. The rest she wrapped again, making sure no insects could reach it. The smallest details mattered. A forgotten lid. A torn basket. A cracked jar. Any one of these could slowly waste precious food gathered through months of careful work. Outside, the sounds of the village drifted gently through the doorway. A donkey brayed somewhere beyond the neighboring houses. Children laughed while chasing one another beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. A carpenter struck wood with slow, measured taps. Farther away, the steady splash of oars echoed from the Nile. Each sound came softly. None disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the afternoon. The youngest child still slept peacefully upon the woven mat. Tiny hands rested beneath one cheek. Slow breaths rose and fell without hurry. The woman adjusted the light linen covering just enough to keep the child comfortable. Watching sleeping children often became one of the few quiet pauses in her day. For a brief moment, there was nothing to lift, grind, carry, or wash. Only stillness. She sat nearby and reached once again for the spindle she had been using earlier. The bundle of flax fibers rested beside her. With practiced hands she began twisting another length of thread. The spindle turned gracefully between her fingers. Twist. Pull. Turn. Again. The movement required little thought now. Years of practice had made it almost effortless. While her hands worked, her thoughts wandered gently through the coming weeks. The flood season would arrive in its own time. Fields would change. Planting would begin again. Children would grow a little taller. Clothing would need replacing. More grain would eventually fill the storage jars. Life always moved in circles rather than straight lines. The same seasons returned. The same work returned. Yet every year carried its own small differences. No two harvests were exactly alike. No two floods rose to the same height. No family remained unchanged. Children slowly became adults. Parents grew older. Grandparents passed into memory. Still, the rhythm of daily life continued. That quiet rhythm gave comfort. As the afternoon stretched onward, another neighbor appeared at the doorway. She carried a woven tray covered with fresh figs gathered that morning. The woman welcomed her inside with a warm smile. The two sat together near the doorway where a light breeze occasionally wandered through. They shared pieces of bread and figs while talking quietly. Their conversation wandered from one simple subject to another. One spoke about repairing part of her roof before the next rainy season. The other mentioned that her oldest daughter had become skilled at spinning flax. They discussed the health of an elderly relative whose legs had become weak after many years working in the fields. Neither woman hurried the conversation. There was comfort simply in sitting together. For many Egyptian women, friendships formed through shared work rather than grand celebrations. They met while gathering water, while washing clothing beside the river, while grinding grain, while weaving linen. Their conversations flowed naturally between practical advice and quiet companionship. They learned from one another every day. A younger woman might ask how to keep grain dry through humid weather. An older woman might explain the best way to repair a cracked cooking pot before it became unusable. Someone else might recommend herbs that soothe tired muscles after long days carrying heavy loads. This knowledge rarely appeared in written records. It traveled instead from voice to voice, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, across generations. The afternoon sun continued shining brightly outside. Heat settled heavily across the village. Even the animals became quiet. Goats rested beneath shaded walls. Dogs stretched comfortably across cool patches of earth. Cats slept wherever they found relief from the sunlight. Birdsong became less frequent until only an occasional call drifted through the still air. The woman and her neighbor eventually stood. There was always more work waiting. Before leaving, the neighbor offered a few ripe figs in exchange for some freshly spun thread. Such exchanges happened often. Not every household produced the same things. Families shared what they had. Sometimes vegetables. Sometimes fish. Sometimes linen. Sometimes bread. These simple acts strengthened the village as surely as the mud bricks strengthened each home. After her visitor departed, the woman gathered several clay bowls. They needed washing before the evening meal. She carried them outside along with a small jar of water. Carefully she cleaned each bowl using sand and water to remove dried pieces of food. The rough sand worked surprisingly well. Each bowl gradually became smooth and clean again. She placed them upside down upon a woven mat where they could dry in the warm air. Nearby, one of the older children returned from the fields. Dust covered the child's sandals. A little sweat darkened the linen clothing. The basket that had carried food earlier now stood empty. The father and the other workers had eaten well. The child shared small pieces of news from the fields. The irrigation canal was flowing steadily. The grain looked healthy. Several neighbors would remain working until nearly sunset. The woman listened carefully. Although she spent much of her time inside the village, the fields remained closely connected to every decision she made. A good harvest meant fuller storage jars. Poor harvests required careful planning. She quietly thanked the child for carrying the meal. Then she offered cool water from one of the clay jars. The child drank gratefully. Even cool water became a small treasure beneath the afternoon heat. Soon afterward, she prepared another simple task. She gathered worn clothing needing mending. Small tears appeared naturally after months of work. Rather than replacing garments immediately, families repaired them again and again. She threaded a simple needle. Patient stitches slowly closed each opening. The fabric became useful once more. Nothing was wasted without good reason. Every piece of linen represented many hours of labor. Growing flax, harvesting, drying, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. One finished garment contained the work of many careful hands. As she stitched, sunlight slowly shifted across the floor. The brightest part of the day was beginning to soften. The shadows inside the room became longer. A gentle breeze returned at last. It slipped through the doorway carrying the familiar scent of the Nile. Moist earth. River reeds. Fresh water. The smell drifted quietly into the home, bringing welcome relief after the long hours of heat. The youngest child awoke slowly. For a moment there was only blinking sleepy eyes and quiet stretching. Then came a gentle smile. The woman welcomed the child with a soft embrace before offering a small piece of bread and a few slices of fig. The child ate happily while watching dust dance through beams of afternoon light. Sometimes the simplest moments became the most peaceful. A quiet room. A full stomach. A gentle breeze. The familiar presence of family. Outside, the village slowly came alive again as the strongest heat began to fade. Builders returned to their work with renewed energy. Merchants reopened shaded stalls. Children laughed more freely. The sounds of conversation drifted through the narrow streets once again. Far across the fields, workers looked toward the lowering sun and quietly judged how much work could still be finished before darkness settled over the valley. Inside the home, the woman began thinking about the evening meal. She measured grain for another batch of bread. She selected onions and herbs. Perhaps there would be lentils cooked slowly over the fire. Perhaps dried fish if enough remained from earlier in the week. Whatever the meal became, she would prepare it with the same steady care that had guided every hour of her day. For managing a household in ancient Egypt was never one great task. It was hundreds of small ones, each woven together so naturally that they became almost invisible. Filling water jars before sunrise. Sweeping away drifting sand. Repairing baskets. Teaching children. Watching food stores. Mending clothing. Preparing meals. Greeting neighbors. Offering kindness. Keeping order. Day after day. Season after season. Year after year. And as the afternoon slowly leaned toward evening, with golden sunlight beginning to soften across the mud brick homes and the calm waters of the Nile reflecting the changing sky, the quiet work of another ordinary day continued, just as it had for countless generations of Egyptian women whose gentle care shaped the heart of every household. The afternoon gradually softened into the gentle light that comes before evening. The fierce brightness of midday slowly faded, and long shadows began to stretch across the narrow village paths. The air was still warm, but it no longer carried the heavy weight of the noon sun. A pleasant breeze wandered inland from the Nile, stirring the reeds along its banks and rustling the leaves of date palms that had stood watch over the village for generations. The woman stepped outside her home and paused for a moment. She looked toward the western sky. The sun had begun its slow journey downward, painting the mud brick walls with a softer golden color. Children who had remained indoors during the hottest hours now filled the open spaces again. Their quiet laughter drifted through the village as they chased one another between the houses or played simple games with smooth stones gathered from the riverbank. Nearby, an elderly man sat beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. His walking stick rested across his knees as he watched the children with peaceful eyes. His own working days had become fewer now. Years spent farming beneath the Egyptian sun had left his back bent and his hands rough with deep lines that told the story of a lifetime of labor. Many older people no longer carried heavy loads or worked long hours in the fields. Instead, they offered something just as valuable. They remembered. They remembered floods that had reached higher than anyone expected. They remembered years when the grain harvest filled every storage jar until there was barely room for more. They remembered seasons of drought, when families carefully counted every handful of grain and thanked the gods for each small blessing. Their memories became another kind of treasure. Children listened carefully. Young parents asked for advice. Life moved forward, but wisdom often looked backward. The woman smiled politely as she passed the old man. She carried an empty basket toward a nearby garden where herbs and vegetables grew in small patches of carefully watered soil. Not every family owned large fields. Many households kept modest gardens close to home. The rich black earth left behind by the Nile's floods made even small spaces surprisingly productive. She knelt beside rows of green herbs whose fresh scent rose gently into the warm evening air. Carefully she gathered coriander. A few leaves of mint. Some tender greens. Each plant had been tended patiently through many weeks. Water had been carried by hand. The soil had been loosened with simple wooden tools. Weeds had been removed one by one. Nothing grew by accident. Everything required quiet attention. As she worked, bees floated lazily from flower to flower. Small butterflies rested briefly before drifting away again. The garden felt calm. Only the distant sounds of village life reminded her that the day was still busy beyond its little walls. She placed the fresh herbs inside her basket and walked toward the home of an older neighbor. The elderly woman lived alone now. Her sons worked in another settlement farther north, and her daughter had married several years before. Neighbors visited often. Not because anyone demanded it. Simply because it was understood that no one should spend too many days entirely alone. The younger woman greeted her warmly. The older woman invited her inside. The house looked much like every other home in the village. Mud brick walls. Simple wooden stools. Clay jars lined neatly along one side. A woven sleeping mat rolled carefully against the wall. Nothing was grand. Nothing needed to be. The younger woman handed over a small bundle of fresh herbs. The older woman smiled with quiet gratitude. In return she offered several dried figs saved from the previous harvest. No money changed hands. The exchange felt natural. Generosity moved gently through the village. Sometimes food was shared. Sometimes labor. Sometimes advice. Sometimes only companionship. The two women sat together for a little while. The older woman spoke about years long past. She remembered carrying water from the Nile as a young girl. She remembered learning to grind grain beside her mother before she was tall enough to see comfortably over the grinding stone. She remembered her wedding day. She remembered holding each of her children for the first time. The younger woman listened with quiet respect. Stories such as these were rarely written upon papyrus. They lived inside ordinary conversations. Without them, much of daily life would have disappeared forever. Eventually the younger woman returned home. As she walked through the village, she noticed how every household seemed to follow its own familiar rhythm. Smoke rose gently from cooking fires. The smell of baking bread drifted through the warm air. Some families prepared fish caught earlier that day. Others slowly stirred pots filled with lentils or beans. A few children helped gather small pieces of firewood stacked neatly beside their homes. Everywhere she looked, people were preparing for evening. Along one dusty path, two boys carefully guided a pair of goats back toward their shelter. The animals walked without resistance. They knew the route well. Behind them came a girl carrying a bundle of reeds gathered near the river. The reeds would later become mats, baskets, or simple roof coverings. Nothing collected from the Nile was wasted if it could serve a purpose. Near another house, a father repaired a wooden stool while his daughter watched closely. The girl handed him small tools one by one. Without realizing it, she was learning. Much of childhood in ancient Egypt was spent watching adults perform everyday work. There were no classrooms for most children. Instead, knowledge lived inside homes, workshops, farms, and riverbanks. Every task became a lesson. Every season became a teacher. The woman reached her own doorway just as the oldest child returned from helping in the fields. The child's face carried the tired look that comes after many hours beneath the sun. Dust clung to bare legs. Fine sand covered the sandals. The woman offered cool water immediately. The child drank slowly. Afterward she gently brushed dust from the child's shoulders with the edge of a clean linen cloth. Small acts of care often passed unnoticed. Yet they filled each day. A scraped knee cleaned with water. A loose sandal strap repaired before morning. Hair gently untangled after a windy afternoon. These moments quietly strengthened family bonds. The woman stepped into the cooking area beside the house. The fire had already been prepared. Small pieces of dry wood rested beneath the clay oven. She arranged them carefully before lighting the fire. Soon a soft crackling sound filled the evening air. The smell of warm smoke drifted upward. She placed a clay cooking pot above the gentle flames. Into it went lentils that had been soaking since morning. Fresh herbs followed. Then chopped onions. A little garlic. Finally she poured in water from one of the large clay jars. The mixture began to warm slowly. Tiny bubbles appeared long before the pot reached a full boil. The pleasant smell gradually spread beyond the doorway. Several children wandered closer. One peeked curiously beneath the lid. Another smiled at the familiar scent. Meals did not need to be elaborate. Simple food prepared with care filled hungry stomachs after long days of work. While the stew cooked quietly, the woman began shaping another batch of dough. Her hands pressed and folded with the same practiced rhythm they had followed every morning for years. The dough became smooth beneath her palms. She divided it into small round loaves. Each one rested briefly before baking. Nearby, one child gathered dry reeds to feed the fire. Another arranged clean bowls for the evening meal. Evening work belonged to everyone. The family moved together almost without speaking. Each person understood what needed to be done. Outside, the village grew steadily quieter. Workers began returning from distant fields. Some carried hoes across tired shoulders. Others led donkeys loaded with bundles of harvested plants. Their pace had become slower now. Long hours beneath the Egyptian sun left muscles heavy and feet weary. Still, there was comfort in seeing home appear once again. As the first farmers entered the village, greetings passed gently between neighbors. No one seemed eager to hurry indoors. People paused for brief conversations. They asked about the day's work. They spoke of water levels in the irrigation canals. They wondered whether tomorrow's weather might remain just as calm. The woman looked toward the edge of the village. At last she saw her husband walking home with several other workers. Even from a distance she recognized his steady walk. His linen clothing carried dust from the fields. His shoulders sagged slightly with honest exhaustion. The long day had taken its usual toll. When he reached the doorway, he smiled quietly. No grand words were needed. She handed him a cup of cool water. He drank deeply before washing the dust from his hands and face. The children gathered around him, eager to share small stories from the day. One proudly described helping repair a basket. Another explained how the figs had been traded with the elderly neighbor. The youngest spoke mostly in cheerful fragments that made everyone smile. As the evening meal slowly finished cooking, peace settled gently over the household. The hardest work of the day had passed. The sky outside shifted from bright gold to softer shades of amber. Birds crossed above the Nile on their journey toward familiar resting places. The breeze became cooler with every passing moment. Inside the home, the clay bowls waited neatly in a row. Fresh bread rested beneath linen cloth. The stew simmered quietly over glowing coals. The family gathered together, surrounded by the simple comforts that careful hands had prepared throughout the long day. And beyond the village, the Nile continued its endless journey beneath the evening sky, flowing as calmly as it had for thousands of years, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of ordinary lives that rose with the dawn, worked beneath the sun, and returned home together as another peaceful Egyptian evening slowly unfolded. The evening settled gently over the village, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment when day became night. The bright gold of the western sky slowly softened into warm shades of orange and rose. Far beyond the green fields, the desert hills began to lose their sharp outlines, becoming quiet shapes beneath the fading light. The air, so heavy only a few hours before, now carried a welcome coolness that drifted across the Nile and through the narrow streets of the settlement. Inside the home, the family gathered for the evening meal. The woman carefully lifted the clay pot away from the fire. Steam rose softly into the cooling air, carrying the comforting smell of lentils, onions, herbs, and warm bread. The simple meal had taken many hours to prepare, not because the cooking itself was difficult, but because every ingredient had passed through many hands before reaching the table. The grain had first been planted beside the Nile. It had been watered by carefully built canals. It had grown beneath months of sunshine. It had been harvested with simple blades. The stalks had been carried home, dried, stored, ground into flour, kneaded into dough, and finally baked inside a clay oven. Even the simplest loaf of bread held within it the quiet labor of an entire community. The family sat together on woven mats. Clay bowls were passed from one pair of hands to another. The youngest child waited patiently, watching the bread with hopeful eyes. The woman smiled gently before breaking a warm loaf into several pieces, making certain everyone received their share. No one rushed through the meal. After a day filled with work, eating became a peaceful moment of rest. The father spoke quietly about the fields. The irrigation channels had carried enough water that day. The grain appeared healthy. A neighbor had suggested repairing one section of the canal before the next planting season. The woman listened carefully. Although she spent most of her hours managing the household, she understood that everything inside the home depended upon what happened beyond it. A healthy harvest meant full storage jars. Poor harvests required careful planning. She quietly considered how much grain remained inside their baskets and whether they might need to use a little less during the coming weeks. Such thoughts came naturally. Managing a household meant always looking a little ahead. The oldest child described carrying the basket of food to the fields earlier that afternoon. The younger children listened with great interest, imagining the wide green fields stretching beside the river. Soon they too would walk those same dusty paths with baskets balanced carefully in their hands. Responsibilities came slowly, one small task at a time. The evening meal ended with dates and fresh figs shared among the family. Sweet fruit was a welcome comfort after long hours beneath the sun. The youngest child carefully saved one small date until the very end, enjoying it slowly as though making the pleasant taste last as long as possible. The woman collected the empty bowls. She poured a little water into each one and began washing them while the last light of day still reached the doorway. Water remained too valuable to waste. Only enough was used to clean the dishes properly. The bowls were then placed upside down upon a woven mat to dry during the cool evening air. Nearby, her husband checked several simple tools used in the fields. A wooden handle had loosened slightly. One rope needed tightening. Another tool required cleaning before tomorrow. Daily care helped tools last much longer. Replacing them was never easy. Wood was valuable. Good craftsmanship took time. Nothing useful was neglected if it could still serve another season. The children helped gather the last pieces of firewood and stack them neatly beneath a small shelter beside the house. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise, those same pieces of wood would become another cooking fire. The rhythm of one day quietly prepared for the next. As darkness slowly deepened, more villagers appeared outside their homes. The heat had finally disappeared. People welcomed the cool evening with gentle conversation. Some families sat upon flat rooftops where the breeze moved freely across the village. Others remained beside their doorways, talking softly with neighbors before sleep. The woman stepped outside carrying a small woven stool. She sat near the entrance of her home and looked toward the Nile. Although the river could not always be seen clearly from every part of the village, its quiet presence could still be felt. The air carried its cool moisture. Frogs began calling among the reeds. Somewhere in the darkness, water birds settled for the night. The steady river continued flowing north, just as it always had. Its gentle movement seemed almost timeless. The sky above slowly welcomed its first stars. One by one, tiny points of light appeared across the deepening blue. Without the bright lights of later centuries, the night sky over ancient Egypt must have seemed endless. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a pale ribbon. Children often looked upward with quiet wonder. The stars became familiar companions, returning every clear evening. The woman had seen them thousands of times. Still, she never hurried past the first appearance of the evening sky. There was comfort in its steady return. Nearby, an elderly neighbor slowly approached with the help of a wooden staff. He greeted the family kindly before taking a seat upon another stool. Soon several neighbors joined them. No one arrived with great purpose. They simply gathered because the day's work had ended. Their conversations drifted gently through many subjects. Someone mentioned seeing unusually large fish near the reeds that morning. Another spoke about a merchant expected to arrive within a few days carrying fine pottery from another town. An older woman remembered a flood many years earlier when the Nile had risen higher than anyone expected. The younger people listened carefully. Stories passed from one generation to another during quiet evenings such as these. There were no books in most homes. No written family histories. Memory itself became the library. As the adults spoke, the children played quietly nearby. One child carefully drew simple patterns in the dust with a small stick. Another arranged smooth pebbles into little circles before sweeping them away and beginning again. Their games required almost no possessions. Imagination provided everything else. The youngest eventually grew sleepy. Heavy eyelids blinked more slowly. A small yawn escaped. The woman gently lifted the child into her arms. The little head rested against her shoulder without protest. The warmth of the day had given way to the peaceful tiredness of evening. Inside the house, she laid the child upon the woven sleeping mat. A folded linen cloth became a light blanket. She brushed a few loose strands of hair away from the child's forehead. Within moments, slow breathing filled the quiet room. She remained there for a little while, watching peacefully. Many mothers across ancient Egypt must have shared moments just like this. After endless hours of work, there came these small islands of stillness. Watching a sleeping child. Listening to evening insects outside. Feeling cool air move gently through the doorway. These quiet moments rarely appeared in paintings or carved reliefs. Yet they were perhaps among the most meaningful parts of ordinary life. Outside, the conversations continued beneath the growing stars. The father spoke with another farmer about repairing part of an irrigation ditch after the coming market day. Someone else discussed exchanging extra flax for better fishing nets. Trade between neighbors often happened naturally, without formal markets. People knew one another well. Trust grew through years of shared work and shared seasons. The woman returned outside and quietly resumed her seat. She had brought with her another piece of flax to spin. Even during peaceful evenings, small tasks continued. The spindle turned slowly between her fingers. The fading light made the work more difficult, but not impossible. She did not hurry. Twist. Pull. Turn. again. The familiar movement almost matched the gentle sound of the river itself. The stars continued multiplying overhead. A thin moon rose slowly above the eastern horizon. Its pale light touched the roofs of the village and shimmered softly upon distant water. Oil lamps began appearing inside nearby homes. Tiny flames flickered behind doorways, casting warm golden light across mud brick walls. Each little flame reminded her that another family was ending another ordinary day. Somewhere nearby, someone quietly sang an old song while rocking a baby to sleep. The melody floated through the evening air before fading into silence. No one applauded. No one performed. The song simply belonged to the night. The woman listened for a moment, smiling softly. She wondered if her own mother had once sung the same tune. Perhaps her grandmother had known it too. Songs, like stories and household skills, often traveled farther than written words. They lived within memory. As the night grew deeper, one family after another wished their neighbors peaceful rest and returned indoors. The village gradually became quieter. Footsteps disappeared. Voices faded. Only the sounds of nature remained. The gentle rustling of palm leaves. The distant croaking of frogs. The quiet whisper of reeds bending beside the Nile. The woman stood and carefully gathered the remaining thread she had spun that evening. Tomorrow it would become part of a larger bundle. Eventually that bundle would become cloth. Later it might become clothing for one of the children or perhaps a fresh linen covering for the household. Nothing happened quickly. Everything required patience. That patience shaped every part of life. She stepped inside the cool house once more. The oil lamp burned with a soft, steady glow. Its small flame cast long shadows across the walls. Clay jars rested quietly where they had stood all day. The baskets remained neatly arranged. The bread for tomorrow morning was safely covered. Everything was ready. Outside, the Nile flowed through the darkness with the same calm rhythm it had followed for countless centuries. Inside the home, surrounded by careful order and peaceful silence, another ordinary day in ancient Egypt gently came to rest, while the woman who had quietly guided every hour of it prepared herself to rise once again before the first light of another dawn. The night settled fully across the Nile Valley, wrapping the village in a quiet darkness that felt both familiar and comforting. The last traces of daylight had faded beyond the western horizon, leaving only the gentle glow of countless stars. The desert, so bright and warm beneath the afternoon sun, now rested in cool silence. The broad river reflected the moonlight in long silver ribbons that drifted slowly with the current. Inside the mud brick home, the small oil lamp still burned. Its flame was modest, no larger than the tip of a finger, yet it filled the room with a warm golden light. Shadows stretched softly across the walls. The woven baskets, clay jars, wooden stools, and folded sleeping mats all appeared calm and still, waiting quietly for another day to begin. The woman looked around the room one last time before preparing for sleep. This had become part of her evening routine through many years. She checked that the clay jars were covered. She made certain that the remaining bread rested beneath clean linen. She gathered the small tools that had been used throughout the day and returned each one to its proper place. The spindle rested beside the basket of flax. The grinding stones stood ready for the morning. The cooking pot had already been washed and placed upside down to dry. Nothing had been forgotten. These simple habits saved precious time when dawn arrived. Morning always seemed to come quickly. She gently lowered the lamp's wick. The flame became smaller. Less oil would be needed through the night. Oil itself represented many hours of careful work, and every drop was valuable. Nearby, Her husband had already stretched out upon a woven reed mat. The long day in the fields had left him deeply tired. His breathing soon became slow and steady. Years of rising before sunrise had taught him to fall asleep without difficulty. The children rested nearby. The youngest slept peacefully with one small hand curled beneath a cheek. An older child quietly turned over before settling again. Outside, the village grew quieter with every passing moment. The voices that had drifted between neighboring homes faded one by one. Doors closed softly. The occasional footsteps upon the dusty paths became less frequent until only silence remained. Yet the night was never completely still. The Nile had its own gentle voice. Water brushed against reeds along the riverbank. A fish occasionally disturbed the surface with a quiet splash. Farther away, frogs called patiently to one another from the marshes. The sounds blended together into a peaceful rhythm that had comforted generations. The woman lay down upon her sleeping mat but remained awake for a few moments longer. She listened. The familiar sounds of the night told her that everything was as it should be. There was great comfort in familiar sounds. The river flowing. The breeze moving gently through the doorway. The soft breathing of family nearby. The faint crackle of the oil lamp before it finally grew still. Sleep came more easily when everything around her felt safe and unchanged. Beyond the village, the fields rested beneath the moonlight. The grain moved gently whenever a breeze crossed the valley. The irrigation canals reflected the stars like narrow ribbons of polished stone. Tomorrow the farmers would return. The fields would once again fill with quiet labor. But for now, even the earth itself seemed to rest. A fisherman remained awake upon the river. His small boat drifted almost silently. The night often offered cooler conditions for fishing. He lifted his net with patient hands, watching the moonlight dance upon the water. His movements were slow. There was no need to hurry. The river rewarded patience. Near another part of the village, a baker had already begun preparing for the coming dawn. His household followed a slightly different rhythm. Bread would be needed early in the morning. While many families still slept, he quietly measured flour beneath the dim light of an oil lamp. His wife helped prepare water. Together they worked without speaking very much. The peaceful silence suited the hour. Not every household slept at exactly the same time. Some responsibilities began while others rested. A woman expecting a child shifted gently upon her sleeping mat. An elderly grandfather awoke briefly before falling asleep once more. A shepherd checked his animals one final time beneath the stars. Life continued softly through the darkness. The woman inside the small mud brick home slowly closed her eyes. Tomorrow would resemble today in many ways. She would wake before sunrise. She would carry water. She would grind grain. She would bake bread. She would sweep the floor. She would prepare meals. She would repair whatever needed repairing. She would comfort tired children. She would greet neighbors with kindness. She would quietly guide another ordinary day. There was peace in knowing what tomorrow would bring. The seasons changed. Children grew older. Harvests came and went. But the rhythm of daily life remained wonderfully dependable. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher above the Nile. Its pale light reached across the rooftops, touching every home in the sleeping village. Some families slept upon their flat roofs during the warmest months, enjoying the cool night air beneath the open sky. Tonight several neighboring households had chosen to do exactly that. Parents rested beside children wrapped lightly in linen cloth. Above them stretched a sky filled with countless stars. Many people knew the patterns of those stars well. Travelers used them while crossing the desert. Boatmen watched them while sailing along the Nile. Priests carefully observed their movements. For ordinary families, they offered something quieter. They offered companionship. Every evening they returned. Every clear night they shone with steady light. A child sometimes asked questions about them. Who placed them there? Would they always remain? Could someone ever count them all? Parents answered as best they could, often sharing stories that had been passed through many generations. Tonight, however, no questions were asked. The children slept deeply. Their dreams belonged only to them. As the night moved gently onward, the cool air settled inside the home. The thick mud brick walls slowly released the warmth they had gathered during the day. The temperature became pleasant. Comfortable. Easy. Insects hummed softly beyond the doorway. A small owl called from somewhere near the riverbank. Palm leaves whispered whenever the breeze returned. These quiet sounds became part of the ancient night. Hours before dawn, when darkness reached its deepest point, the village appeared almost timeless. If someone had stood upon a nearby hill and looked across the valley, they would have seen only scattered points of warm lamplight fading one by one. Beyond them lay the broad ribbon of the Nile. Beyond the river stretched fields sleeping beneath the stars. Beyond the fields waited the silent desert. The same landscape had welcomed countless generations. It would welcome countless more. Inside the home, the woman's breathing had become slow and peaceful. The tiredness earned through honest work had finally given way to deep rest. Her hands, which had carried water, kneaded bread, spun flax, mended clothing, comforted children, and managed every quiet detail of the household, now rested gently by her side. Tomorrow they would begin again. But not yet. For now, there was only stillness. Far away, in another village along the Nile, another woman slept after a day much like this one. She too had risen before dawn. She too had carried heavy jars. She too had watched over children, prepared meals, and carefully guarded her family's precious stores of grain. Across Egypt, thousands of households rested beneath the same sky. Each one different. Each one familiar. Each one held together by steady hands that rarely appeared in monuments or royal inscriptions, yet quietly shaped the lives of everyone around them. The night continued its gentle journey. The moon slowly drifted westward. The stars turned almost too slowly to notice. Time itself seemed to breathe at the pace of the river. And somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, still hidden below the edge of the world, another dawn patiently waited, preparing to awaken the villages, the fields, the fishermen, the bakers, the merchants, and the women who would once again guide the quiet heartbeat of every Egyptian household with calm hands and peaceful determination. Long before the first pale light reached the eastern horizon, the Nile Valley rested beneath its quiet blanket of stars. The air was cool in a way that could only be felt during the deepest hours of the night. The heat gathered by the earth during the previous day had slowly drifted away, leaving the village peaceful and still. The silence was gentle rather than empty, filled with the soft murmur of flowing water, the whisper of reeds along the riverbank, and the occasional call of a night bird passing overhead. Inside the small mud brick home, the family remained asleep. The oil lamp had burned low during the night. Only a faint glow remained within the little clay bowl that had held the flame through the evening. Its last light gently touched the rough walls before finally fading away. Darkness settled comfortably across the room. The woven sleeping mats rested side by side. Folded linen blankets covered the children. Clay jars stood quietly where they had been placed the evening before. Everything was exactly as the woman had left it. She believed that ending one day with careful order made the beginning of the next day much easier. Outside, the village seemed almost frozen in time. The narrow streets were empty. The market stalls stood closed. The workshops where potters, carpenters, and weavers spent their days were silent. Even the donkeys and goats rested quietly, their breathing slow beneath simple shelters built from reeds and wood. The stars shone brightly above them all. Without clouds to hide the heavens, the sky appeared endless. Ancient Egyptians knew the sky well. They watched its patterns throughout the year. Certain stars told them when seasons were changing. Others helped travelers find their way during long journeys. The heavens moved with dependable rhythm, just as the Nile did below. Nothing seemed hurried. Nothing seemed uncertain. The woman slowly opened her eyes. She did not awaken because of noise. Her body simply knew the hour. Years of rising before dawn had become part of her life. She remained still for a few quiet moments, listening. The youngest child slept peacefully. Her husband had not yet stirred. Outside, only the river could be heard. She took a slow breath. The cool air felt pleasant after the warmth of the previous afternoon. These peaceful moments before sunrise belonged almost entirely to her. Soon the home would fill with movement. There would be grain to grind, bread to bake, water to carry, children to guide. But for now, there was only stillness. She quietly sat up, careful not to wake anyone. The woven mat gave a soft rustle beneath her. She folded her blanket neatly and placed it against the wall. Even the smallest habits reflected years of careful household management. Nothing was left scattered. Everything had its proper place. She tied her simple linen garment and gently braided a few loose strands of hair that had come free during the night. The morning air slipped through the doorway, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth from the Nile. Somewhere beyond the village, frogs still called softly among the reeds. A fish disturbed the quiet water with a gentle splash. The eastern sky remained dark, yet there was the slightest hint that dawn was approaching. She reached for one of the empty water jars. Its smooth clay surface felt cool beneath her hands. Fresh water would be needed before anyone else awakened. The family would drink from it. Bread would be made with it. Vegetables would be washed. Hands would be cleaned after the day's work. Every morning began with water. She stepped outside. The village looked completely different beneath the stars than it did during daylight. The dusty paths appeared silver beneath the moonlight. Palm trees cast long quiet shadows. The rooftops blended softly into the darkness. A gentle breeze moved through the settlement without disturbing its peaceful silence. As she walked toward the well, she noticed several familiar figures already making the same journey. Other women had risen early too. No words were needed at first. Each understood why the others were there. Morning work waited for every household. Soon one neighbor smiled warmly. Another offered a quiet greeting. Their voices remained soft so as not to disturb the sleeping village. They lowered buckets carefully. The rope creaked gently. Water echoed against the sides of the well before the heavy bucket slowly rose once more. Each woman filled her jars patiently. No one pushed ahead. There was enough time. The day had only just begun. Balancing the heavy jar upon her shoulder required steady strength. Years of practice had made the movement graceful. Still, the weight was real. Carrying water every morning slowly shaped the body. Strong shoulders. Steady arms. Sure footsteps. The path home became one of the most familiar journeys of her life. She knew every stone beneath her sandals. Every doorway. every turning in the narrow lane. As she returned, the eastern horizon showed its first faint band of pale gray. Night had not yet ended, but dawn had begun its quiet approach. Back inside the house, she poured the fresh water into the larger storage jars. The cool sound of flowing water echoed softly against the clay. She covered each jar carefully. Dust could easily spoil clean water if left uncovered. Again, the smallest details mattered. She reached toward the grinding stones. They had waited patiently through the night. Now another day's work would begin. She poured grain between the stones. The first slow movement filled the quiet room. Stone rubbed gently against stone. A low, steady sound rose into the morning darkness. Again. And again. The rhythm was unchanging. Many villages along the Nile awoke each day to this very sound. Before birds began singing. Before merchants opened their stalls. Before farmers walked toward the fields. The sound of women grinding grain quietly announced the beginning of another day. Her hands moved confidently. The heavy upper stone circled across the lower one. Fine flour slowly gathered beneath. A faint cloud of grain dust floated into the cool air. She paused only long enough to brush it gently aside. The work demanded patience more than speed. Nearby, the youngest child turned slightly while still asleep. The familiar sound of grinding grain had likely accompanied every morning since birth. It was as ordinary as birdsong. As dependable as sunrise. As comforting as the river itself. Outside, another quiet sound joined the morning. A rooster called from somewhere beyond the neighboring homes. Soon another answered farther away. Then another. The village slowly stirred. A donkey shifted inside its shelter. Goats began moving softly. A dog stretched before settling once again. The world awakened little by little. The woman continued grinding. Her shoulders rose and fell with calm determination. This flour would become today's bread. Tomorrow's grain still waited inside its storage jar. The cycle never truly ended. Each morning prepared for the next. Each loaf of bread became tomorrow's strength. When enough flour had been prepared, she carefully sifted it through a woven basket. Tiny pieces of husk remained behind. The finest flour collected inside a clay bowl. She added cool water. Then she mixed in a portion of yesterday's dough, carefully saved to help today's bread rise. Nothing useful was wasted. Even yesterday quietly helped tomorrow. Her hands pressed the dough gently. Fold. Turn. Press again. The movements required almost no thought. Her muscles remembered them even before her mind did. Outside, the first birds began singing from the palm trees. Small sparrows fluttered across the rooftops. A pair of ibis flew low over the river, their long wings catching the first hint of light. The eastern sky slowly changed from gray to pale blue. The stars began disappearing one by one. Only the brightest remained. The woman looked briefly toward the doorway. Another sunrise was arriving. The cool air carried the fresh smell of damp soil left by the night's gentle moisture. Soon warmth would return. The dusty roads would fill with footsteps. Workshops would open. Boats would move along the Nile. Children would laugh. Merchants would call softly to customers. But for just a little while longer, the world remained wonderfully quiet. She placed the smooth dough beneath a clean linen cloth and allowed it to rest. While waiting, she stepped outside once more. The first rays of sunlight touched the tops of the distant palm trees. Golden light slowly spread across the fields. Mist hovered above the calm surface of the Nile before quietly lifting into the warming air. She watched the river for a few peaceful moments. It flowed with the same gentle confidence it had shown yesterday. The same confidence it would show tomorrow. The river never hurried. Neither did the morning. Around her, the village awakened with quiet purpose. Doors opened one by one. Neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles. Children rubbed sleepy eyes. Smoke rose from the first cooking fires. Another ordinary day had begun. And once again, with calm hands, careful planning, and a heart shaped by years of gentle routine, the woman stepped into the steady rhythm of her household, carrying forward the quiet work that had sustained Egyptian families through generation after generation beside the timeless waters of the Nile. The first golden light of the new day spread slowly across the Nile Valley, touching the tops of palm trees before reaching the roofs of the village. The mist that had rested gently above the river drifted away as the morning grew brighter. Reeds along the banks shimmered with tiny drops of moisture, and the calm surface of the water reflected the pale sky like polished stone. The village awakened without haste. One doorway opened, then another. A woman stepped outside carrying an empty basket. An old man stretched carefully before beginning another quiet morning. A young apprentice hurried after his father, trying to match longer footsteps with his own smaller stride. The sounds of waking life blended together so gently that they seemed part of the morning itself. Inside the house, the woman uncovered the dough she had prepared before dawn. It had risen softly beneath the linen cloth. She pressed one finger gently into its surface. The dough slowly returned to its shape. It was ready. She divided it into several round loaves with practiced hands. Each loaf was shaped carefully, turned once or twice, and placed upon a smooth wooden board while the clay oven grew hotter. The fire crackled quietly. Dry reeds and small pieces of wood burned with a steady flame. The pleasant smell of warm earth mixed with wood smoke drifted through the doorway and into the street outside. Neighbors recognized that familiar scent. Many homes were beginning to bake bread at nearly the same hour. The fragrance floated across the village, mixing with the fresh morning air. For a traveler arriving at sunrise, the smell alone would have spoken of ordinary family life. Bread baking. Cooking fires. River water. Damp earth. Palm leaves warmed by the first sunlight. The woman carefully placed the first loaf into the hot oven. She knew exactly where to set it. Years of experience had taught her how different parts of the oven held slightly different amounts of heat. One loaf might bake a little faster than another depending on its position. There were no markings. No measurements. Only observation and memory. While the bread baked, she stepped outside with a woven mat. She shook it gently to remove the fine layer of dust that had settled during the previous day. A small cloud drifted into the morning breeze before disappearing. The mat was returned to its place inside the home. Everything was prepared before the day became busy. Soon the youngest child wandered toward the doorway, still rubbing sleepy eyes. The morning light fell softly across the child's face. For a moment there was only quiet curiosity. Then came the familiar smile that greeted each new day. The woman knelt beside the child. She poured cool water from one of the clay jars into a small bowl. The child washed face and hands while blinking at the brightening sky. Morning washing had become a habit learned almost before memory itself. Simple routines quietly shaped every day. The child looked toward the oven. The smell of fresh bread had already filled the room. The woman laughed softly without saying a word. She knew exactly what the child was hoping for. Soon enough, a warm piece of bread would be cooling upon a cloth. Patience came more easily when one knew it would soon be rewarded. Outside, the sounds of the village grew a little stronger. A potter opened the wooden shutters of his workshop. Clay vessels stood neatly arranged upon shelves, waiting to dry beneath the growing sunlight. The potter examined each one carefully. Some required another day before firing. Others were ready for the kill. His hands carried the same quiet confidence as the woman's. Different work. The same patience. Farther along the dusty road, a carpenter lifted a wooden plank onto a simple workbench. He paused before beginning. The wood had been difficult to obtain. Every cut would be made thoughtfully. Mistakes could not easily be repaired. Across the village, nearly every craft demanded careful attention rather than speed. The woman returned to the oven. The first loaf had turned a rich golden color. She removed it carefully using a flat wooden tool. Warm steam escaped as it touched the cooler air. The crust crackled faintly while it cooled. One by one, the remaining loaves followed. Soon several fresh rounds of bread rested upon a clean linen cloth. Their comforting aroma filled the entire house. She set aside enough for breakfast. The remaining bread would be carefully stored. Some would be eaten later in the day. A little might remain for tomorrow morning. Nothing would be wasted. The oldest child had already begun helping with smaller household tasks. Without being asked, the child gathered the empty grain basket and carried it toward the storage area. Another checked that the clay water jars remained covered. Responsibility arrived slowly. Not through commands, but through example. Children copied what they saw every day. The woman rarely needed to explain every task. Years of quiet observation had already become their teacher. As breakfast began, the family gathered once more. Fresh bread. A few dates. Onions. Perhaps a small piece of cheese if one remained from recent trading. Simple food. Enough to prepare everyone for another long day. The father ate steadily before leaving once again for the fields. His hands already showed the roughness of years spent working the soil. Fine cracks crossed the skin of his fingers. His forearms had grown strong beneath countless seasons of labor. Before leaving, he thanked his wife with a quiet smile. There was little need for long conversation. Each understood the work of the other. Each depended upon the other completely. He lifted his tools and stepped onto the dusty path. Soon he disappeared among other workers walking toward the green fields beside the Nile. The woman watched for a brief moment before returning inside. The day was only beginning. Many hours of work still waited. She gathered the clothing washed the previous afternoon. The linen had dried completely. Now each garment needed folding. She spread one piece across her lap. The fabric felt cool and smooth beneath her fingers. Fine linen was one of Egypt's most valued materials. Even ordinary households cared for it with great attention. A torn edge was repaired before it became worse. Stains were washed as quickly as possible. Clean garments reflected careful household management. As she folded each piece, she noticed one small tear near the hem of a child's tunic. It would need mending later. She set it aside. Another quiet task joined the list waiting for the afternoon. Outside, a merchant's voice drifted through the village. He had arrived with a donkey carrying woven baskets, pottery, and small household items. Several women stepped from their homes to look. Not everyone intended to buy. Sometimes people simply enjoyed seeing goods brought from another village. The merchant greeted everyone politely. He spread a woven cloth upon the ground. Clay bowls of different sizes. Small jars. Wooden spoons. Bundles of rope. Simple sandals. Nothing extravagant. Only useful things needed in everyday life. The woman walked over carrying a small bundle of freshly spun thread. Perhaps a trade could be arranged. The merchant admired the fine thread. He examined its smoothness between his fingers. After a few quiet moments of discussion, they reached an agreement. The thread was exchanged for a sturdy new clay bowl. The old bowl at home had developed a tiny crack. Soon it would no longer hold water safely. This new one would serve the household for many years if treated carefully. She thanked the merchant warmly. Returning home, she carried the bowl with both hands. Its smooth surface caught the morning sunlight. Simple objects often became trusted companions in daily life. A well-made clay bowl might be used every day for many years. Children would grow while eating from it. Harvests would come and go. The bowl would quietly remain. Back inside the house, she placed the new bowl beside the others. It fit naturally into its place, as though it had always belonged there. Order returned once more. The home felt complete. Outside, the sun continued its steady climb. The cool freshness of early morning slowly gave way to gentle warmth. Birdsong became less frequent as the day grew brighter. Along the river, fishermen pulled in their morning nets. Some boats already turned toward home carrying fresh catches. Others drifted farther downstream before beginning their work. The woman stepped into the doorway and looked toward the distant shimmer of the Nile. Its waters moved with the same calm rhythm that had guided the lives of her parents, her grandparents, and generations far older than memory. Every morning began with familiar work. Every evening ended with peaceful rest. Between those two quiet moments stretched the countless small acts of care that held a household together. They were rarely celebrated. They were seldom written down. Yet they formed the gentle heartbeat of ordinary life in ancient Egypt, where patient hands, thoughtful planning, and quiet kindness transformed simple mud brick houses into warm and welcoming homes beside the timeless river. As the morning gently unfolded, the village settled into its familiar rhythm once again. The cool freshness of dawn slowly gave way to the warmth that would grow stronger as the hours passed. Sunlight spread across the fields beside the Nile, making the green grain shimmer whenever a light breeze wandered through. The river itself continued its quiet journey, reflecting the bright sky while fishing boats drifted peacefully along the current. Inside the home, the woman placed the new clay bowl among the others and looked around the room with quiet satisfaction. Everything had its place. The fresh bread had been covered. The water jars were full. The cooking area was clean. The sleeping mats had been rolled and stored neatly against the wall. The clothing had been folded, except for the small tunic waiting to be mended later. There was comfort in seeing a home prepared for the day ahead. The work was never truly finished, but each completed task made the next one a little easier. She stepped outside carrying a small woven basket. Today she planned to visit the riverside market before the heat became too strong. Markets in ancient Egypt were lively places, but they were rarely hurried in the way many modern markets are. People came not only to exchange goods but also to share news, greet neighbors, and learn what had happened in nearby villages. The dusty path toward the market was already beginning to fill with quiet movement. Farmers carried baskets balanced across their shoulders. Fishermen returned from the river with fresh catches wrapped in damp reeds. Potters carefully transported newly fired jars, walking slowly so that nothing would crack before reaching its new owner. Women carried woven bags containing thread, cloth, vegetables, or small items they hoped to exchange. Children followed close behind, eager simply to see the busy morning. The woman walked at an easy pace. She did not hurry. The market would still be there when she arrived. Along the way she passed a young scribe seated beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. A small writing board rested across his lap. His reed pen moved carefully across a sheet of papyrus. Few ordinary villagers needed to write every day, but scribes served an important role throughout Egypt. They recorded harvests, counted grain, kept accounts, and copied official documents with patient precision. The woman nodded politely as she passed. The scribe returned the greeting with a quiet smile before continuing his careful work. Soon the sounds of the market became clearer. Gentle conversation. The soft braying of donkeys. The rustle of woven baskets being opened. The splash of fish placed into shallow trays filled with cool water. The market occupied an open space not far from the river, where fresh breezes made the morning more comfortable. There were no grand buildings. Most merchants simply spread woven mats upon the ground or arranged their goods beneath simple reed shelters. Everything felt orderly without being formal. One merchant displayed onions, garlic, and bundles of fragrant herbs. Another offered baskets filled with ripe dates gathered from nearby palm groves. A fisherman arranged silver fish in neat rows, their scales catching the sunlight. Potters displayed rows of jars, bowls, and water vessels of many shapes and sizes. A basket maker carefully stacked his work one inside another to save space. Each object reflected many hours of quiet labor. The woman wandered slowly from one stall to the next. She paused before a weaver displaying beautifully made linen cloth. The fabric felt smooth beneath her fingertips. She admired the careful weaving. The weaver explained that the flax had come from fields farther south along the Nile, where the harvest had been especially good that season. The woman smiled. She knew exactly how much work lay hidden inside every length of cloth. First came the planting. Then harvesting. Drying. Separating the fibers. Spinning thread. Weaving on the loom. Washing. Drying again. Every finished piece carried countless patient hours within it. Although she admired the linen, today she had no need for more cloth. Instead, she continued walking. At another stall she found fresh cucumbers, leafy greens, and small bundles of herbs whose fragrance filled the air. She exchanged several handfuls of dried beans from her basket for fresh vegetables. The trade pleased both families. Neither felt they had gained more than the other. Fair exchanges helped strengthen trust within the community. Nearby, two elderly women sat together beneath a woven canopy. Neither appeared to be buying or selling very much. Instead, they quietly watched the morning unfold. People greeted them warmly as they passed. Their faces were familiar to everyone. Years had made them respected members of the village. One smiled as the woman approached. "Your children are growing quickly," she said softly. The woman nodded with quiet pride. "They seem taller every season." The older woman laughed gently. "So does every season itself." The words were simple. Yet they carried the peaceful wisdom of many years. Time moved quietly. Children became adults almost without anyone noticing. Parents slowly became grandparents. The river flowed through every generation with the same calm patience. After thanking the women, she continued through the market. A young basket maker caught her attention. He was carefully weaving fresh reeds into a large storage basket. His fingers moved quickly but never carelessly. Each reed bent into place with practiced ease. The basket slowly grew stronger with every careful movement. She watched for a few peaceful moments. Good craftsmanship always invited quiet admiration. Nearby, a little girl sat beside her mother, learning the same skill with much smaller pieces of reed. Her tiny basket leaned slightly to one side. Several strips had slipped out of place. The mother gently corrected them without criticism. The child tried again. Learning came through patience, not perfection. The woman smiled as she walked on. She recognized something familiar in that gentle lesson. It was much the same way she taught her own children. Little by little. One task at a time. One morning after another. As the sun climbed higher, the market slowly grew busier. Voices became slightly louder, though never harsh. Children carried small bundles for their parents. Donkeys waited patiently beneath patches of shade. Birds fluttered overhead, hoping to find forgotten crumbs of bread. The pleasant smell of fresh bread mixed with herbs, vegetables, river water, and warm earth. It was the smell of ordinary life. She stopped beside a fisherman displaying freshly caught tilapia. The fish had been pulled from the Nile only a short time earlier. Their bright scales reflected the sunlight. After a brief conversation, she exchanged several onions and a small bundle of spun thread for 2 fish. Tonight's evening meal would be a welcome change from lentils. The fish were carefully wrapped in broad green leaves to keep them cool during the walk home. She thanked the fisherman warmly. As she turned away, she noticed a group of children gathered around an elderly storyteller sitting beneath a palm tree. He held no scroll. No painted pictures. Only his voice. The children listened quietly while he described animals living far to the south, where the Nile began its long journey. Perhaps the stories had changed slightly over the years. Perhaps they had grown a little larger with each telling. That mattered very little. The stories carried wonder. They carried memory. They connected young listeners to places they might never see. The woman paused only long enough to hear a few gentle sentences before continuing home. The morning was passing. Many household tasks still waited. The path back to the village felt warmer now. The sun had climbed well above the horizon. Shadows had become shorter. Palm leaves moved only slightly in the growing heat. She balanced the basket comfortably against her hip. Inside rested vegetables, herbs, and the wrapped fish. Enough for another nourishing meal. Along the way she met another woman returning from the well. They stopped for a brief conversation beneath the shade of an acacia tree. They spoke about the coming harvest. About children. About an elderly neighbor who had begun feeling stronger after several days of rest. Their words flowed gently, without hurry. Soon they wished each other a peaceful day and continued along their separate paths. When the woman finally reached home, the familiar doorway welcomed her once again. She stepped inside and placed the basket carefully upon a wooden stool. The house felt cool compared to the bright sunlight outside. The thick mud brick walls protected the family from the growing heat. She unpacked each item slowly. The herbs were sprinkled lightly with water to keep them fresh. The vegetables were placed in a shaded basket. The fish rested inside a cool clay dish until evening. Everything found its proper place. The household, once again, had quietly prepared itself for another day. Outside, the Nile continued flowing through the heart of Egypt, carrying boats, fishermen, merchants, and travelers from one village to another, while inside this modest home, the steady hands of one woman continued the gentle work that had nourished families for generations, one careful task, one peaceful morning, and one simple act of kindness at a time. The sun continued its slow climb across the wide Egyptian sky. Morning was giving way to the quiet middle hours of the day, when shadows became shorter and the warm light settled gently over the valley. The breeze that had drifted easily across the river at sunrise grew softer now, and the reeds along the banks stood almost still. Beyond the village, the fertile fields glowed with deep shades of green, while the desert beyond them rested in pale silence beneath the bright heavens. Inside the home, the woman carefully unpacked everything she had carried from the riverside market. She never hurried this part of the day. Fresh food deserved careful attention. The herbs were laid upon a damp linen cloth to keep them from drying too quickly. She trimmed a few stems with a small bronze knife before placing them into a shaded basket. The cucumbers were arranged beside onions and garlic, where the air remained cooler inside the thick mud brick walls. The fish received the greatest care. She unwrapped the broad green leaves and examined each fish closely. Their scales still shone with freshness. She rinsed them gently with cool water from one of the clay jars, then sprinkled a little salt over the skin before placing them into a shallow clay dish. They would remain in the coolest corner of the house until evening. Meals often required planning many hours before they were actually prepared. A household was guided not only by today's needs, but also by tomorrow's. The woman covered the dish with another clean cloth. Dust drifted easily through every village, especially once the day became warm. Keeping food protected required constant attention. Nearby, the youngest child had become fascinated by a tiny lizard that had paused upon the sunny doorstep. The little creature remained perfectly still, blending almost completely with the color of the wall. The child knelt quietly, watching with wide eyes. After a long moment, the lizard darted away so quickly that it almost seemed to disappear. The child laughed softly. The woman smiled without interrupting her work. Small discoveries filled childhood. A colorful bird. A smooth river stone. A curious insect climbing across a reed basket. Life offered gentle wonders to anyone patient enough to notice them. She reached for the child's small tunic that needed mending. The tear near the hem was not large. With careful stitching, it could easily last another season. She threaded a slender bronze needle. The linen thread slipped smoothly through the tiny opening. Her hands began moving almost without thought. One stitch. Then another. The thread pulled the edges together little by little. Outside, the sounds of the village drifted through the doorway. A donkey carried several large baskets toward the river. Its steady footsteps pressed softly into the dusty path. A potter called quietly to a customer examining a group of newly fired jars. Farther away, someone was beating woven rugs to remove the fine dust collected during the previous week. The sounds rose and faded like gentle waves. Nothing disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the day. The woman finished the final stitch and held the tunic up toward the light. The repair blended neatly into the fabric. Only someone looking very closely would notice where the cloth had once been torn. She folded the garment carefully and placed it beside the others. Again, another small task had quietly reached its end. There was satisfaction in such moments. Not because the work was finished forever. It never was. But because every careful repair helped the household remain strong. She looked toward the roof. Many Egyptian homes used their flat rooftops throughout the day. Laundry dried there. Bundles of flax rested in the sunlight. Sometimes grain was spread out briefly to remove moisture before returning to storage. The woman gathered a woven basket containing several lengths of damp linen and climbed the short staircase leading upward. The rooftop welcomed her with warm sunlight and a gentle breeze. From there she could see much of the village. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires. Palm trees swayed almost imperceptibly. Children helped adults carry water or sweep courtyards. Beyond everything shimmered the broad ribbon of the Nile. Boats moved slowly along its surface. Some drifted with the current. Others relied upon square linen sails catching the light breeze. From this height the village appeared peaceful. No grand temples dominated the view. No towering monuments filled the horizon. Instead there were homes, gardens, small workshops, simple shelters for animals. Ordinary lives unfolding quietly beneath the sun. She spread each piece of linen across smooth ropes stretched between wooden posts. The breeze lifted the edges gently. White cloth fluttered against the blue sky like quiet birds resting upon invisible branches. The sunlight would finish drying the fabric before afternoon. As she worked, she noticed another woman upon a neighboring rooftop. The neighbor was sorting onions into several baskets. Some would be eaten soon. Others would be dried for longer storage. The two women exchanged warm smiles across the narrow lane. Their conversation carried easily through the still air. They spoke about the market that morning. The merchant with the beautiful pottery had already continued toward another village. The fisherman had sold every fish before midday. Someone mentioned hearing that the Nile's water level looked promising this season. Such conversations connected every household. News traveled gently from roof to roof, doorway to doorway, and well to well. The woman remained on the rooftop for a few peaceful moments after finishing her work. She enjoyed the breeze, the warmth of the sun upon her shoulders, the distant sparkle of the river. Sometimes these quiet pauses were the closest thing to rest she experienced all day. Not complete rest. Only a few peaceful breaths before returning to the next task. She descended the staircase carrying the now empty basket. Inside the house, the coolness felt welcome after the bright rooftop. The youngest child had gathered several smooth pebbles near the doorway and arranged them into careful little circles upon the floor. One by one the child moved them into new patterns. No toy had been needed. Only imagination. The woman watched for a moment before gently asking the child to help sort dried dates into smaller baskets. The child nodded eagerly. Little hands carefully counted each date. Some were larger, some smaller. Each found its place. Learning often began with ordinary work. Counting fruit, folding cloth, carrying small bundles, watching dough rise beneath linen. Every simple task quietly prepared children for the responsibilities they would someday carry. Outside, the warmth continued growing. The fields shimmered beneath the sunlight. Farmers paused occasionally beneath small patches of shade before returning to their work. Oxen pulled simple wooden plows where needed. Along irrigation canals, workers checked that water continued flowing smoothly toward every field. The Nile itself never reached every crop directly. Careful planning guided its life-giving water through an intricate network of channels built and maintained by many hands. The woman thought about the fields as she measured grain from one of the storage jars. She did not need more flour immediately. Still, experience had taught her never to wait until supplies became low. A little grain prepared each day prevented long exhausting hours later. She poured the grain into the grinding stones once again. The familiar rhythm returned. Stone against stone. Slow circles. Patient effort. Flour slowly gathered beneath. The sound drifted softly through the doorway into the village beyond. Elsewhere, many other women were performing exactly the same work. Though separated by walls and narrow streets, their mornings followed similar paths. Across Egypt, thousands of grinding stones turned beneath steady hands. Thousands of clay ovens baked fresh bread. Thousands of mothers quietly planned meals, watched over children, mended clothing, organized stores of grain, and prepared homes for another peaceful evening. History often remembered the names of kings. It measured time by dynasties and monuments. Yet beneath every reign, ordinary households quietly continued their own dependable rhythm. The woman paused briefly and brushed a little flour from her hands. Sunlight now reached farther across the floor. Tiny particles floated through the bright beams like drifting dust upon the river breeze. The house smelled pleasantly of fresh bread, cool clay, drying linen, and newly gathered herbs. It was a simple scent. A familiar scent. The scent of a well-kept home. Outside, a pair of swallows darted through the open sky, catching insects above the village. Their graceful flight seemed effortless. The child watched them from the doorway, pointing excitedly as they circled and disappeared beyond the rooftops. The woman followed the child's gaze for a moment. The birds would return tomorrow. Just as the river would continue flowing. Just as the sun would rise. Just as another day of quiet household work would gently unfold beneath the timeless sky of ancient Egypt, where every ordinary morning carried within it the patient care, thoughtful planning, and steady devotion that kept families warm, nourished, and together beside the eternal waters of the Nile. Now the day has gently folded itself into evening once more. The last warmth of the sun slowly slips behind the western hills, leaving the Nile wrapped in soft shades of gold, rose, and quiet blue. The river that carried fishermen at dawn, reflected busy boats at midday, and cooled tired workers at sunset now moves almost silently beneath the first stars. The village grows still. Cooking fires become smaller. Their thin trails of smoke disappear into the peaceful night air. Children, worn pleasantly tired from another ordinary day, rest beside their families. Their quiet breathing fills the little mud brick homes with a feeling of comfort that no grand palace could ever replace. Inside one small house, the woman who has guided her household from the first moments before sunrise finishes her final task. She gently places a clay bowl back upon its shelf. She folds one last piece of linen. She checks that the bread for tomorrow is safely covered. She lays a hand upon the cool clay jar of water, knowing it will greet the family again with the coming dawn. There is nothing hurried now. Nothing left to carry. Nothing left to mend. Only the peaceful reward of honest work completed. Her husband rests nearby after another long day in the fields. The children sleep soundly upon woven reed mats, their dreams as quiet as the breeze moving through the doorway. Outside, neighbors speak only in whispers before wishing one another a peaceful night. Soon every doorway closes. The narrow streets become empty once again. The donkeys settle into silence. Goats lie comfortably beneath simple shelters. Even the birds have tucked themselves among the branches of palm trees beside the river. Above them all stretches the vast Egyptian sky. The stars seem endless. They shine with the same gentle light that watched over countless generations before this family and would continue long after them. They ask for nothing. They simply remain, patient and steady, night after night. The Nile continues its timeless journey. Its quiet waters flow through darkness with the same calm rhythm they have always known. The river remembers every season, every flood, every harvest, every ordinary morning when women carried water upon their shoulders before the first light appeared. It remembers the sound of grinding stones before dawn, the smell of warm bread rising from clay ovens, the laughter of children running through dusty lanes, the careful hands that repaired baskets instead of replacing them, the neighbors who shared food without keeping count, the families who gathered together at the close of each day beneath the soft glow of oil lamps. These were not the stories carved into towering monuments. They were quieter than that. Yet they were the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Kingdoms rose and faded. Dynasties changed. New rulers came, and others were gently carried into memory. But morning still arrived over the Nile. Bread was still baked. Children still learned by watching patient hands. Neighbors still greeted one another kindly. Homes were still filled with simple acts of care that quietly held the world together. Perhaps that is why these ordinary lives feel so peaceful to imagine. They remind us that history is not made only of great names and grand buildings. It is also made of warm meals shared together, of clean linen drying beneath the sun, of quiet conversations beside the river, of families finding comfort in familiar routines. As the night deepens, the moon rises a little higher. Its pale reflection stretches across the calm water. A soft breeze stirs the reeds one final time. Somewhere far across the river, a lone bird calls once before settling into silence. The village sleeps. The fields rest beneath the stars. The palm trees sway almost too gently to notice. The river continues onward, never rushing, never stopping, carrying the peaceful rhythm of countless ordinary days into another quiet tomorrow. And now, as the cool night settles softly over the ancient land, the sounds grow fewer. The voices fade. The footsteps disappear. Only the steady whisper of the Nile remains. May that gentle river carry every thought a little farther away. May the warm desert breeze grow softer. May the little oil lamps burn low. May the stars watch over the quiet homes along the riverbank. And may this calm journey through the peaceful world of ancient Egyptian households slowly drift into silence, like gentle water flowing beneath a moonlit sky, until there is nothing left but stillness, the quiet breath of the night, and restful sleep.